Mobile gaming, whether you love it or hate it, it's all the rage these days, and throughout the years there have been some remarkable attempts at bringing great gaming experiences on the go. But when you talk about handhelds specifically, there are probably a couple big ones that most people are immediately going to think of, things like the Switch, 3DS, and more recently, the Steam Deck. But today I want to talk about one of the most infamous examples of a big player in the console wars coming up with a really great idea and failing to deliver spectacularly. It was Sony who wanted to put a PS3 in the palm of your hand, and while that's obviously not possible, mobile hardware in 2011 was getting pretty capable, and if you could get close enough to the experience of gaming on a home console, some sacrifices could be made here and there to put it into an ultra-portable form factor. And with this philosophy in mind, Sony eventually released the PlayStation Vita in Japan on the 17th of December 2011, and it made a wider debut in February of 2012 in North America and Europe. But over 10 years on, I think we can pretty safely say that the Vita has seen just as much success as my YouTube career. But what exactly went wrong with the PlayStation Vita? Was it just a victim of its own innovations, kind of like the Wii U was? And what exactly makes it so worth investing in as a platform so many years after Sony's made it clear that they didn't care about it? Well, I think we can start with the hardware itself. When you pick up the Vita, it will pretty much be immediately clear that it was designed to play games first. It's got a really nice D-pad, surprisingly good analog sticks, and overall just a really good weight and feel, and I think it looks really cool too, but that's beside the point. What's important here is that the Vita lets you focus on the experience, and there's nothing about the hardware getting in the way of that. For example, the 5-inch OLED touchscreen, which was unheard of even in regular TVs at the time, looks just incredible. The colors are extremely vibrant, and blacks are black, and honestly I'm a little surprised it took until the Switch OLED for anyone else to bring such a good display to a handheld. The 3DS's two low resolution screens honestly just look terrible by comparison, and while the 3D will always be a really nice gimmick, the viewing angles are aside from the touchscreen and all the face buttons, you also get the rear trackpad, which works the same as the front touchscreen, and it's a little awkward to use at first, and not too many games ended up using it. It's still a really nice feature to have though, and as good of a device as the Vita was both on paper and in people's hands, there were a few things that made it a lot less attractive to many players, like for example, the stupid proprietary memory card format that was designed to keep people from tampering with their systems, and of course gave Sony a complete monopoly on any future expansion you might have wanted to add to your system. The launch model Vita is useless without a memory card, and they could set you back anywhere from $20 for the smallest 4GB card, all the way to $100 for the biggest at the time 32GB card, which was just ridiculous when you consider the Vita's base price of $249 for the Wi-Fi only model. But Sony didn't see this as a problem. From their perspective, they were the only ones giving players a true console-like experience on the go, and people would be willing to fork over the extra money to get into the Vita ecosystem rather than going to the 3DS, which had objectively lesser hardware. But the issue was, Nintendo wasn't exactly their main competition. This right here is the Samsung Galaxy S3, a smartphone that made its debut in the May of 2012. It also sports a quad-core ARM processor, quad-core GPU, 1GB system RAM, and not to mention a very nice 720p AMOLED touchscreen. Putting these two devices side by side, it's almost uncanny just how similar they are. Both have their nice OLED displays, both have a very pocketable form factor, and even their design language is almost identical. So if you already got a smartphone like this, what's the point in getting a Vita? At a time when There's an App for That was being taken seriously enough for Apple to trademark it, most people didn't see the appeal of bringing another dedicated piece of gear into their life unless it did something really useful. In a way, Sony was definitely Nintendo's biggest competition in the handheld space, but that's not to say that Nintendo was Sony's biggest competition, and adding 3G to the launch model Vita only made this problem way worse, because most people were not going to invest a whole extra SIM card into a device that they couldn't even make calls with, when they could just as easily entertain themselves with the phone they already had. And that, at least in my opinion, is what Sony did wrong. It was never a problem with the Vita itself, it was a problem with Sony completely underestimating their competition and not fully understanding what kind of a market they were competing in. And because of that, they didn't get the third-party support that they needed to keep the Vita afloat, which meant a smaller player base, and the cycle goes on. And that's not to say that the Vita didn't get some really impressive first-party titles. It got everything you would expect from a PlayStation, whether that be Uncharted, Killzone, Final Fantasy, Little Big Planet, and a lot of these are really faithful entries into each of their own series. And there was no lack of exclusives either, at least for a little while, until games like Gravity Rush and Tearaway had remasters on the PS4 because nobody was playing them on the Vita. But for a time, the Vita offered some high quality and really unique experiences that you couldn't get anywhere else. But for every good release, you also get plenty of bad ones, and the Vita was a dumping ground for a bunch of the most just terrible asset flips you could possibly imagine, and horrible shovelware, as was every other app store at the time. It sounds like things were a little better in Japan, with the Vita building more of a cult following as a home for smaller visual novels and RPGs, but that didn't help give the Vita any kind of a universal appeal. So the PlayStation Vita is dead. At least that's what Sony will tell you if they admit it ever existed in the first place. They might have tried to keep it alive here in the West, marketing it as an accessory for PS3 and PS4 owners to remotely play their console libraries, and in a very not-so-Sony move, they also helped a lot of indie devs bring their games to the platform, but that doesn't change the fact that their original vision for the Vita never panned out. But as the Vita was failing to see success in the consumer market, modders and enthusiasts were tearing into the hardware to see what they could do with it. And the Vita homebrew scene is honestly the main reason that I ended up getting mine, because it's a very versatile piece of hardware, and the things that the community have put together are truly amazing. And at this point, modding your system is almost a necessity if you're a Vita owner, in my opinion, due to the absolutely ridiculous prices of the original Vita memory cards, especially since they've been discontinued. That's why I have a 4GB Vita memory card, which is just enough to get the custom firmware set up, and then I actually added a micro SD card by using this little adapter called SD to Vita. This just allows you to use any regular micro SD card in place of a physical Vita game, and actually using the custom firmware, you can mount this adapter in place of the original Vita memory card. And that's how I added 128GB of storage to my Vita for $17, which is the same price I paid for the original 4GB card. The Vita homebrew scene has pretty much everything you would expect, say ports of popular software like RetroArch and a bunch of other emulators, which makes the Vita one of the coolest handhelds you can get for emulating older games, in my opinion. And with most cores, the Vita has the power to give you a really good experience as well. You can also use software like Adrenaline to unlock extra features of the Vita's built-in PSP emulator, so you can load the XMB, change a bunch of image processing settings for playing PSP games, and even add your own PSP games as bubbles on the Vita's home screen. And if that's not enough, the Vita has also seen a ton of indie devs porting their games as homebrew software, which is really cool to see for an older system like this that wouldn't be getting any new releases otherwise. But since the hardware itself really opens up a lot of possibilities, we get plenty of other cool things. Want to turn your Vita into a capture card? Just install a plugin and connect it to your computer, and your Vita will cosplay as a regular USB camera. Or maybe you want to pair a PS3 controller? Why not? Just install another plugin. You can even overclock this thing if you have custom firmware installed, and I don't know why you'd want to do that, but you can. I'll make sure to leave links to all of this in the description because there's a lot to unpack here, and it's honestly pretty ridiculous what the Vita can do just with some simple mods. Another fun use of custom firmware is to bring online play back to certain titles. Take Little Big Planet for example, which had its servers shut down on all platforms over a year ago now due to rampant attacks, and while they eventually came back for PS4, us PS3 and Vita owners were locked out permanently. But with custom firmware and a little bit of modification, you can actually get Little Big Planet back online with Project Lighthouse custom servers. I'll leave more information for all of this in the description, as the servers haven't officially launched yet, and there's still a pretty fair amount of work to be done, but what we have right now is really promising. And none of this would have been possible without the incredible work of both the homebrew community and of course game preservation projects like Lighthouse that have been stepping in to give us the services that Sony won't. And since the hardware isn't all that different from a typical phone of the time, it's also really easy to develop for. The open source Vita SDK has reverse engineered all of the APIs within the Vita's firmware that developers need to start designing new apps for the Vita. And if you were so inclined, you could even start porting or writing your own software, which is really cool to me. Someone is even maintaining a version of the Godot game engine, so if you really want to make a game in a modern, powerful engine, you can, and it'll run on the Vita. The point that I'm trying to make here is that the Vita, right now in 2022, is a completely different system and platform than it was when it launched, and it's honestly way more interesting to use now than it ever was back while Sony was only pretending to care about its player base. But it's fun to look back and see what Sony had tried and unfortunately failed to do with the PlayStation Vita, and I'm very glad that I ended up getting mine, because it offers an experience and a ecosystem that feels so different than anything else you could pick up right now and play games on. It's definitely not the most powerful system, and it has its limitations, but the software and the community around it more than make up for it. Anyway, that's pretty much my sort of retrospective, sort of homebrew rambling video of the Vita. So let me know what you thought. Did you ever have a Vita, and are you interested in getting one? Stuff like that. Anyway, I really hope you enjoyed the video. Thank you very much for watching, and have a good one.